Good afternoon. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Gladden Pappin, and I'm the Deputy Editor of American Affairs, as well as Assistant Professor of Politics at the University of Dallas. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our discussion today of transatlantic relations in the Biden era, updating the positions of the United States, Europe, and Poland. Today's event is a co-production of American Affairs and the Warsaw Institute. American Affairs is a quarterly journal of public policy and political thought, founded in 2017 by Julius Krein, the editor, and myself. The Warsaw Institute, which you can find at warsawinstitute.org, is the noted Polish think tank focusing on geopolitical issues. They regularly publish the Warsaw Institute Review, which monitors a range of geopolitical issues through their China Monitor, Russia Monitor, and others. I have the honor to host today's discussion between Elbridge Colby and Paweł Pawłowski. So thank you both for joining us. Mr. Colby is a co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a policy research think tank focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained global competition. Prior to starting the Marathon Initiative, Mr. Colby was, from 2018 to 2019, director of the defense program at the Center for a New American Security, where he led the center's extensive work on defense issues. Prior to that, in 2017-2018, Mr. Colby served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. He also served as the primary Defense Department representative in the development of the 2017 National Security Strategy. So thanks so much, Bridge, for joining us. Paweł Pawłowski is chairman of the Foundation Council at the Warsaw Institute, the geopolitical think tank based in Poland. He's also vice president of the board of the Cegielski Center for Analysis, a graduate of the Law and Administration faculty of the University of Warsaw. Mr. Pawłowski has worked in geopolitics on both sides of the Atlantic, including in Washington, as well as throughout the Polish finance sector. In addition to his work on geopolitical matters, he also manages a leading regional transportation company in Poland. Transatlantic discussions all too often leave out the important role of individual nation states in European and global affairs. The approach motivating today's discussion is a different one. From the standpoint of domestic affairs, the issues facing European countries and the United States are more and more often similar, in some cases even the same. From the response to the coronavirus pandemic to the issues motivating populism, and the regulation of big tech. From a geopolitical standpoint, which is our topic today, the preceding presidency in the United States marked a partial shift toward considering issues important to Central and Eastern Europe, particularly with President Trump's visit to Warsaw in 2017. So I want to start off the discussion today by asking our panelists about that transatlantic relationship. Transatlantic relationship has often been defined by that between Washington and the European Union as a whole, with a strong emphasis on understanding Atlanticism in terms of the relationship between Washington and Brussels, or just as often, or maybe even more often, between Washington and Berlin. But there are other things that are coming up on the horizon that are worth considering, namely China's continued ascent on the world stage. So to start it off, I thought I would ask both of our panelists to consider that a bit and discuss the question of how, with China's continued ascent on the world stage, this transatlantic relationship might be changing. Bridge, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks, Gladden, and great to be on this panel with American Affairs and the Warsaw Institute and with Paweł. Look forward to the conversation. Yeah, I mean, I think the rise of China will, in a sense, determine the nature of transatlantic relations, and in particular in the kind of mode or light that you're pointing, which is the tendency, particularly in the last couple of decades, for Washington, and I think it's reasonable to anticipate that the Biden administration will approach in this way, would look to Brussels and to some extent Berlin as the leading sort of European power to align, to essentially treat Europe as a coherent whole. My view is that Washington's approach to Europe is going to have to be a derivative of Europe's role towards and posture towards China. I mean, to step back a second, for the world and certainly for the United States, China is the overwhelming challenge and must be the overwhelming priority, and particularly China and Asia. And that's a military reality. It's a political and economic reality. Asia will be more than 50% of global GDP. China itself will be well over 20% of GDP probably going forward, certainly in purchasing power parity terms. So Europe is therefore America's secondary theater. I think in multiple ways, but if you look at just in GDP terms, I think Europe will be around 20 to 25% of global GDP, maybe a little bit more. But necessarily, Washington will have to offload some burdens and economize its efforts. Doesn't mean a withdrawal, to the contrary, but it does mean a more economical approach than either has been the case in the past before President Trump, and in some ways before President Obama. And actually, I think contrary to the way the Biden administration seems to be approaching it, and we can talk about that more. But I think the bottom line here is that Washington's priority is going to be on Asia. And so if the European Union broadly aligns, or Europe as a whole broadly aligns with this effort, and this doesn't mean just doing whatever the United States does, then there's a deal to be had, I think, which is in exchange for the U.S. treating kind of Europe as a more coherent whole, then Europe will generate scale in terms of trade, economics, and international political influence with not only the United States but other key members of, say, the Quad, such as Japan, India, Australia, that oppose Chinese aspirations for hegemony over Asia. And in that case, even though we might have interest in dealing much more with bilaterally, I think our tendency will be to work with Europe, since it will be more coherent, and that will be a kind of reasonable deal. If, on the other hand, Europe equivocates or pursues what President Macron has sort of signaled and others, something like a third pole, which inherently is very clearly an attempt to distance from the United States and sort of equivocate or equilibrate between the United States and China, then I think the United States will, just as a geopolitical matter, really need to look more to the coalitions within Europe. And we'll see who that might be. But I think, in any case, the U.S.-Polish relationship will be strong. I mean, even in the first category, I think the U.S. will not just sign over its policy, obviously, to Brussels. But I think in the second category, we will look more towards a kind of autonomous or independent policy positions from the independent European states or coalitions among them. And I think, candidly, early signs are a bit sobering. I think people maybe are overstating a little bit the comprehensive agreement on investment that the European Union, Germany, France seem to have made with China, but it's certainly significant. And then I think there was just a report this morning about rules on artificial intelligence, which is kind of touted as an area for real transatlantic cooperation. And, President Macron was pretty skeptical about deep collaboration with the United States at the Munich Security Conference. Chancellor Merkel was tepid, maybe a little bit more than tepid, but not exactly jumping in with both feet. So I think, realistically, we'll probably end up somewhere in between at this rate. But that's a lot of this is going to be in Europe's hands.
Bridge, just one quick follow-up before we, and then I'll ask Paweł to intervene on the same subject. How do you think the Biden administration views its relationship to Europe in this context? Do you think it understands the way that relationship has to be calibrated with respect to China, or does it view those as two separate fields? How closely tuned in on that strategy do you think it is?
I think the Biden administration and certainly President Biden himself, based on his speech at Munich, they really very deeply believe in the transatlantic relationship, and particularly alignment among democracies. And I sort of think of it as like a global approach to alliance management, that they are really, the president said from almost like the depths of his being, I think that shared values as democracies should mean I don't think it's unfair to say something like very tight alignment between the United States and Europe. So this is a very high standard. I think, in fairness, the Biden team does understand, or at least portions of it, do understand the challenge posed by not only China, but also the enduring challenge from Russia, Iran, of course, terrorism, other problems in the world. And so there's a way in the accounts balance. I think what they seem to be betting on is a very, very deep alignment, particularly with the world's other democracies. And of course, most of them are many of them, certainly the advanced ones, are in Europe. So I think that will be the test. I personally am skeptical, since I think, frankly, that as I mentioned, the Chancellor and President Macron have signaled that they will probably not agree fully. So I actually our better approach, which the Biden team may come to at some point, but is to expect less and hold Europe to it, hold our relations to it. But I think there's a bit of a almost a romantic approach. That's a little bit, I don't mean to be snide, but really a deep faith that the democracies will align. And I look at the world more through a geopolitical perspective, and I think that's the world that we're re-entering. So
let's come back to that subject in a minute. And Paweł, what would you like to add on this? How does this look from your standpoint?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to say that I'm very happy I can be here and meet with in such a distinguished company. Well, I believe that the transatlantic relations are essential to the strategic picture of the globe, and we had wonderful examples in the past when that Western alliance led to the victory over in First World War II and Second World War II over the Nazi Germany. And finally, the Cold War was also won by the Western Alliance, and it wouldn't be possible without the strong transatlantic relations. Of course, now Europe has to learn how to cooperate with the United States when we are the secondary theater, as it was said here today. Of course, it's a new situation for us. And I think it's difficult for many European countries that used to be great superpowers. It's not the case of Poland, so our point of view and the point of view of the countries in our region is a little bit different. This is why we are more eager to cooperate with the United States and to strengthen that transatlantic ties, because we believe that this is part of our security. And security for Central and Eastern Europe is not just a phrase. It's something very real, because not so long time ago, Russian or Soviet troops were present in our region. When I was born, the Soviet Red Army was still in Poland. So, these memories can change the perspective of the nation in Central and Eastern Europe. Of course, Russia today is a declining power. There is no doubt about it, but still very disruptive. And we can see many examples of Russia's influence, not only in Eastern Europe, like in Ukraine, but also in other theaters, like in Syria, for example. And I believe that this strong transatlantic relation can help us to overcome these difficulties. Now, Russia is no longer the most important player and counterparty, but there is a Chinese competitor, great superpower, that is trying to exploit the divisions between European countries also, but mainly between Europe and the United States. Very quick move in December with great help of Germany, when the negotiations of the CAI were conducted very quickly. Suddenly, they were very quickly, because it wasn't the case before December, and that agreement can be very difficult for the future of transatlantic cooperation. We can say that it will strongly affect the ability of, for example, European companies to cooperate with United States companies, because we might be wake up in the Chinese digital ecosystem, which will be not cooperating with the American one. So there are many questions. Of course, it's not that all European countries are supporting the comprehensive agreement on investment with China. Italy, Spain, Poland, these countries are very skeptical against that idea, and I believe that it won't be as easy as maybe Germany thought. That cooperation between Europe and China, or between Central and Eastern Europe and China, was also it's also connected with the 17+1 format. And recently we had a meeting with President Xi Jinping, and that meeting was not a success, to say that quite politely. It wasn't success for China. It's very clear that the America's efforts in recent years, introduced by the Trump administration, were quite successful, when we see that many European countries were not interested to participate in that meeting on a level that Chinese leader would require. So we have many questions here. We have many streams that are present here, and for Central and Eastern Europe, that transatlantic cooperation is also a case of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We were expecting firm actions from the United States that would say that it's not a good idea for Germany to participate in that project that will strongly affect countries that are transit countries for gas connections in Europe. And for now, I see only sanctions that are covering Russian entities, and I think it's not enough to stop the project. That is particularly important for Russia and Germany, and it's a great concern for the security of Baltic states and of Poland too. So we'll see how the transatlantic cooperation will work in reality. I mean, I have a feeling that we had a lot of expectations and they were quite inflated. And now we're coming back to the reality, even though in Munich we had some kind of a romance. We'll see what will be the reality.
Bridge, any comments on that?
Oh, I'm not sure there was romance from the European side. I think Pawłow's comments were well taken. I think there was a kind of a courtship or a declaration by the United States. But as is her wont, I thought the chancellor was signaling caution and kind of a middle course relative to where things are, and President Macron was signaling a pretty different approach. And of course, he's been talking about this for some years. So, but yeah, no, I think that's about it.
So let's turn to that question of romance or romantic views of the purposes of foreign policy, which might be sneaking back in more broadly. So, Bridge, do you think the arrival of the Biden administration marks overall a return to American foreign policy based on the ideology of democracy promotion? I know you already touched on this a little bit in the context of discussing how responses to China might shape up. But more generally, do you think that is coming back into play? And if so, do you think that's the the same? You think it's the same ideology of democracy promotion, but counterweighed somewhat by other concerns, or do you expect the new administration to be sensitive to geopolitical concerns?
Well, I think they're definitely very keenly aware of the geopolitical concerns. And when you say, there are many different people with many different views. I mean, there are people who are, I would regard as pretty hard-nosed realists, in particularly working on the Asia file. And there are people in other areas who are not, who are much more sort of a transformational or sort of true liberal in the kind of international relations sense. I think that's in their, there's a sort of realist kind of pragmatic side. There's a sort of liberal democracy promotion side. And then there's a very strong, although not so strong in the appointees, but in the party as a whole, a kind of a left-wing progressive, focus on home. The U.S. is kind of the source of the problem. I don't think that's going to have a particularly strong influence as such in the Biden administration as a whole. So I think it'll be mostly a tug between this liberal and sort of more pragmatic kind of view. But I think, I think they're talking about geopolitics, but I think they actually they seem to be looking at the world through a quite, I would say muscular liberal or liberal hawk lens. I mean, I think when you hear, certainly I mentioned the president's remarks and also at the State Department, when you listen to Secretary of State Blinken, talking about rivalry between techno-democracies and techno-authoritarianism. This is kind of his tag phrase of the last year or two. When you look at the actions on Myanmar, for instance, they just sanctioned Russia over the Navalny issue. They just, of course, are sanctioning Saudi Arabia, and they knocked Saudi Arabia down a couple pegs, as well as potentially the Emirates. A strong line on Taiwan, which I commend them for. But it's to me, I mean, it's shades of Bill Clinton, a little bit of shades of John F. Kennedy, honestly, sometimes, which President Biden would probably appreciate, frankly. But I think my sense is it's a pretty assertive sort of liberal view of the world, very much focused, as he said, on democracy, democracy, democracy. He said that 3 times. And predicated on the logic that democracies will align with each other. And I think that one of two things, either that the U.S. is in a better relative position than many of us fear, or vis-a-vis China in particular, but overall, or that it's really about soft power, that's what matters. And I don't mean like, who buys what, app on the App Store, but I mean, overall perception of legitimacy. And that's where I think in their heads, I think Jake Sullivan, the security advisor, said that the number one priority, I think he said at USIP, the number one priority for the administration would be domestic renewal, because that is critical for national security. And I think the way they think about it is, if people look at us as the shining city on the hill, then they will come to us and we will be able to form this coalition, and together we will take on great power competitors, and and then we'll be in great shape. So from what I can tell, they're acting as if that's the way that's what they believe. So it's going to be a big international relations test case in some respects. I don't mean to be flippant about it, but it's certainly unlike say President Obama, I think I certainly disagree with him personally on a lot of the political preferences, but his outlook on the world was more, I don't want to say it was kind of realistic, but he had a more, I think, limits of how states would act, how political coalitions would form. I don't think Obama had a romantic rhetorical style, but in his actual behavior, I don't think he had that political romanticism, certainly internationally.
When Jake Sullivan talks about domestic renewal, what do you think that means for him? Because there's a sense in which a strong economy and strong industrial domestic renewal could actually form the basis of foreign policy alliances, just as it does for China, which has become a huge economic powerhouse in its region. I sense that's not quite what he means by it. At least I'm not sure. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that just a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think on the economic side, I think Sullivan does mean that, but it wasn't. I don't think it was the first couple of things he mentioned. I can't remember. And I give him credit. He's been thinking a lot about this and the economic renewal. In fact, my understanding is he's paid some attention to American affairs. So he's caught into that, and I think that is the basis for bipartisan work in the United States and international coalitions, for instance, over securing supply chains, reshoring certain things that we don't want to be exposed to. But I think in from what we can tell from the Biden administration, this also has to do with alleged systematic racism, inequality, deep thoughts in the American polity that are much more contentious politically within the United States. But I think that seems to be a pretty important part of their kind of strategy, if you will, for how this is going to play out.
Mr. Pawłowski, anything you'd like to add on that? Or how do those look from a Polish standpoint?
Well, I'm afraid that it might be only the rhetoric, and we won't be as good as it's only said. But we hope that democracy will be important for Biden administration, and opposing the authoritarian state and supporting democratic oppositions in countries like Belarus. But on the other hand, I'm worried if we understand democracy in the same way, because last year's events in the United States, huge protests and left-wing radicals that are opposing the principles that were at the foundation of the United States. This is something that, from perspective of the Central Europe, is quite worrisome for us. I'm worried when I see that the Western Alliance is getting weaker and weaker, and our values are not allowing us to be as effective as for example, China. And it's not only about big discussions, but I see that when I talk with ordinary people, when they say me, well, in China, people live normally, even though there is a COVID-19. Well, I say, yes, they live normally, of course, except those who are in the concentration camps. And this is the perspective we have to keep in mind. And I think that Biden administration should show that democratic countries, that democracy is a better system, because in last year, and especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, we are not showing that our way of organizing societies is winning, and it's better than the authoritarian one or even totalitarian. There are also other things that are on the left agenda, which are for a conservative country, relatively conservative country, as a Poland, quite well. I'm also worried how the United States will support the countercultural revolution in countries who are their allies, and are strongly influenced by the United States. Well, we will wait and see, but maybe from your perspective, it's more clear than from ours how it will work in fact, yes?
Yeah, it seems like there are maybe a couple of different senses of democracy or democratic alliance on the table, and that maybe that issue is seen a little bit differently here, again, depending on the valence that one assigns to it, seen a little bit differently here. And from Poland, which after all is a democratic country. But if you take the view of democracy promotion as, heavily weighted on democratic values rather than, geopolitical alliance among democracies, then it seems that maybe Paweł, you're suggesting that leaves Poland feeling a little bit more nervous.
Yes, I think that's the point. We were a little bit nervous when the former ambassador Georgette Mosbacher was made some remarks on our internal affairs concerning the LGBT rights in Poland. I think it is something that can be even stronger during the Biden administration actions. So this is something that is quite concerning for us. Yes.
Why don't we talk a little bit about the role of Germany in Europe and how Poland sees its relationship with Germany, and how how the place of Germany fits into the questions we've been discussing as a whole. In the political era that immediately followed the collapse of communism, the 1990s, European politics and perhaps especially Germany were marked in deep ways. So how do the current shifts in geopolitics as a whole affect the place of Germany in Europe, and how do we need to grapple with that, both as Americans and from the perspective of our Polish allies?
I understand that was a question for me. Well,
or for both
Germany
of you.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Germany is our biggest partner, economical partner. It's a country that was always important for Poland. We did have many issues, but we're cooperating very strongly. German companies are strongly present in Poland. Germany supported our presence in NATO structures and in the European Union. And we have very tight relations. But on the other hand, when we talk about the European Union, we do not refer to Brussels. Oftentimes, we just refer to Berlin. And this is showing the perspective that is changing in Europe, that Germany used different tools to ensure its leading position within the European Union. And we see that process is getting stronger and stronger, and Berlin's position as for many people seems to be it's in many ways dominating in our region, especially in our region where those economical dependencies are stronger, because at the beginning of the changes after the collapse of the Soviet Union, our companies were so weak. They were on one hand there was state-owned, very poorly managed companies. On the other hand, there were small enterprises with no knowledge about how to build a real company that will be able to compete in modern realities. So countries like Germany had a good position to dominate our market. In many ways, that was the case of Poland and other countries like Czechia. Yes. Now German influences, when there is a great power competition and this leading position of the United States is questioned, and the current state is not a bipolar world, but there are some other local superpowers. And I think that Germany has an ambition to become a superpower named the European Union. Of course, I sometimes make jokes with my friends that it's like with the magic rings, each European country has its own magic ring, but there is also a ring of power that it's a leading one and can dominate them all. Of course, luckily, Germany it's not a Sauron or anything like that. But to be quite serious, the Green New Deal in Europe, European Green Deal, and before that, the monetary union, Eurozone. All these initiatives are leading us to the greater position of Germany in Europe. And I had, like many others, I hoped that the German position will be aligned with those strong transatlantic ties, especially last year when Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer sent the letter that she wants Germany to become a strong ally of the United States and to become responsible partially for the security of the region. that it occurred that that address wasn't supported by all political powers that are in charge of Germany, that it was only a part of the coalition CDU and CSU, and the SPD is entirely not supporting that point of view. It's quite worrisome, and we see that the direction was quite opposite, CAI, and the cooperation with China that is in short term quite beneficial, especially economically, but in long term can lead German huge companies, giants, to their collapse. So there are some great chances, and I believe that Germany will use those chances to build better cooperation within Europe and with the United States. But there are also many threats for the whole region to be stable and prosperous and free.
Bridge.
Yeah, I mean, one point I'd just like to make, just apropos of the last conversation, but I think it's relevant here too, is I think, my view is that we need to look at our foreign policy much more clearly through a geopolitical lens. I mean, I have my strong views about what the direction American society should go. I know you do too, Gladden. My view is the purpose of American foreign policy is to enable us to be able to work out our problems on our own terms, largely, and generate a sufficient broadly distributed prosperity so that, that's sort of the promise of American life. There's obviously a strong material element, but, so kind of realist temperament or predilection. But more importantly, I think it's necessary. I mean, we lived through a generation in which the United States was unchallenged in power terms in a kind of quasi-unipolar world or unipolar world. And in that world, I mean, we embarked on a lot of, ideological campaigns from both Republicans and Democrats in various different ways. And I think those didn't work and are unlikely to be successful strategies for the goals I mentioned for American foreign policy. So, my thought to Pawłow's point, I mean, without getting into the specifics of given policies, is I don't think the United States should be advancing an ideological agenda for in and of itself as a prime goal of its foreign policy, whatever that ideological goal may be. It's important for us to support Republican government, broadly speaking, and just certainly in our own country to ensure its job. That's not what will lead to success for the American people. So my referring to the Biden administration is more to say that I don't think this is going to work. That I think it's based on I disagree with Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken's preferences, no doubt, but more to the point here, and it's in a conversation that's about geopolitics, I don't think what they're saying is going to work. I don't think states will align together purely based on democracy to a sufficient degree to do what we need to do, which is sustain favorable regional balances of power in the key regions of the world, above all Asia, but also Europe. It's just, and I think as Paweł pointed out in the Germany case, they're kind of demonstrating the point. I mean, the Germans have a rhetorical style that is very, very liberal in the kind of international relations sense. I mean, rules-based international order, multilateralism, peace diplomacy, these kinds of things. But in practice, Germany is actually quite pretty realpolitik in its pursuit of its. I think Paweł mentioned, agglomerating power and influence within the Eurozone, or the European Union in general, but certainly within the Eurozone. How deliberate that was, I'm sure others would be better positioned to say. But, when you look at from where things were to where things have come, I mean, the introduction of the euro has worked out to the benefit. Europe is, largely concentrated around Germany as in political economy terms. And Germany continues to spend quite little on defense, kind of putting burdens on others, particularly the United States and to some extent Poland. And then when given the chance to align pretty clearly with the United States over China with the CAI, including with an incoming Biden administration that had really made a very serious outreach to them, Chancellor Merkel chose to go in a different direction. And we'll see how that works out in practice. But I think I've kind of gone through the stage of grief a little bit, but I'm sort of unemotional about it at this point. I think we need to recognize that Germany is more likely to pursue a more narrowly scoped set of interests that are largely related to Europe and its immediate area. I agreed with AKK's speech, and even that, which was mostly about taking care, it was not about a Cold War with China, it was about contributing more to defense of NATO territory, addressing regional contingencies, for instance, in North Africa. And even that has struggled to get traction, as Pavel pointed out. So I think, to me, with Germany, the Americans need to understand what it is that Germany really wants, not what Germany necessarily says it wants, but what it actually wants, which is going to be primarily, I think, a lot of commercial interest, a lot about Europe, and more kind of Europe-focused interest. And again, I'm not saying this is bad. I actually think this is perfectly natural. It's just it's misaligned a little bit with the kind of things you hear in these big conferences. And so I think, we have to work with Berlin closely, and we share a very strong alliance in many respects with Berlin, but it's also got elements of significant difficulty, if not elements of certainly a difficult dynamic. And that means that we need to work with Poland. Obviously, we do share, democracy and other values, but I'm always a bit, I sort of raise an eyebrow about descriptions of the Transatlantic Alliance as being based on values, because I think, frankly, anybody can see there are profound differences in values within the United States. And of course, we do share, democratic forms of government, but Europeans, particularly Western Europeans, have very different issues on a lot of things than large numbers of Americans. So I think if we root our transatlantic understanding too much on values, it's kind of a shifting sand. It's not clear what exactly it's rooted on. I think it's an important component, but to me, it's more of a glue that exists to sort of harden and cohere something that exists more for geopolitical purposes. And I do think those geopolitical purposes are there. And I think the U.S.-Poland relationship is actually founded on very firm ground politically, because the U.S. always, as the external superpower, essentially, and I would describe China as a superpower as well, but it's always has a natural alignment with second tier in power terms. I don't mean normatively, of course, but second class power terms, states that are afraid of being dominated. And so that's a natural alignment, certainly with Poland, the United Kingdom, to some extent, Italy potentially over time. And frankly, sometime it may become more natural with France, depending upon the future. And Gladden knows much more about France than I do, I think. But depending on the political evolution in France, we'll see if Germany becomes as dominant as will France agree to a kind of a second fiddle, to use the American expression, kind of role. And again, this is not to say that we're actively looking to frustrate Germany, but I think we will want to have strong relationships independently with these European states and not root everything with Brussels. And this is something that I think I do worry about with the Biden team, was that they'll be sort of this knee-jerk tendency to work through Brussels. And I think certainly we should work through Brussels, but we should also work with the independent, the capitals in Europe.
Yeah, you seem to be suggesting that although you could say that Germany has always sort of read its geopolitical interests through the European Union, that in some sense that's now becoming clearer, and opening up a space, at least potentially. Whether or not it'll be occupied is another question, but at least opening up a space for dealing on geopolitical terms with other capitals within Europe. So, Pavel, how would you like to react to that? Just the question of what role the nations of Central and Eastern Europe have to play in specific terms as American and European relations become shaped, or should be shaped, by this response to China.
Gladden, can I interject, just because I think you said one thing, excuse me, Pavel, but I think you're right that we need to maintain relations. But I think our position towards Europe should not be inherently oppositional or trying to detract from it. I think this is how we treat Europe will primarily be based on how deep the alignment and meaningful the alignment between Europe and the United States and Japan and India relative to the China challenge will be. So the relatively little military contributions in Asia, but in terms of generating economic scale that, consistent with the kinds of issues you guys have been raising in American affairs, technology standards, et cetera, to be able to generate the scale to offset China, which on its own is going to have 1.4 billion people in its internal market, not to mention whatever coalition it begins to assemble through a combination of inducements and fear. So if Brussels, and with Berlin being the leading power in Europe, if Brussels and Berlin are willing to meaningfully align in a realistic, I think President Biden is setting a realistic standard, but it's more than what Chancellor Merkel is setting. So that's where that conversation should be. But if Berlin is willing to do that and Brussels are willing to do that, and also take up more responsibility in Europe, for instance, militarily through defense spending, then I think we should take a much more favorable position towards Europe. Doesn't mean that we cut off contact, of course, with national capitals, but it means I think we would lean much less on that kind of effort. Sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to clarify that point.
No, thanks so much, Paweł.
Excuse me, I had some problems with my connection, so I didn't hear your last question. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was asking the question: as American and European relations become shaped by the response to China, from your standpoint, what specific role do the nations of Central and Eastern Europe have to play?
Well, I believe that China is showing great interest in the region of Central and Eastern Europe. It's also because of the reason, it's one of the reasons is because we are at the gate of Europe, and all those infrastructure projects that are particularly important for China, like Road and Belt Initiative, have to cover Central and Eastern Europe. And we can see different approaches in different countries. For example, Hungary is showing that for Hungary, China is a great important partner, and they will use, for example, Chinese vaccine to fight COVID-19. They are strongly involved in all those infrastructure projects that are supporting Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And this is why this 17+1 format was created by China. And we can see that it's not working properly, that there are some other projects, especially we can say that the Free Seas Initiative that was initiated by Poland and Croatia with great support of the United States. We remember Donald Trump's visit in Warsaw in 2017, and when he took part in the meeting of the Three Seas Initiative. And it's important because that initiative is setting a different approach for especially infrastructure projects, digital projects or transportation infrastructure. And of course, it's also about energy. It all started with energy, with LNG from the United States, and how it can change the view for Central Europe in terms of energy and independence from Russian sources. And I believe that the Three Seas Initiative is a great project that allows the United States to cooperate with the region, not with single countries, but with the region, and support initiatives that are building stronger ties between those countries that are on the eastern flank of NATO and that will be able to oppose all hostile actions from the east. Of course, those actions are led mainly by Russia, but we can see that those connections between Russia and China are quite strong. So I believe that this is something that is affecting the policy in region, and it's also thanks to the United States involvement that was particularly seen by personal involvement of Donald Trump in 2017.
And a direct investment commitment from Secretary of State Pompeo, as I recall.
That's right. That's right. $1 billion. That was the declaration. There are some. We don't see that this money for now, but the countries of the Free Seas initiatives are participating in the Free Seas Investment Fund. That is a commercial initiative to fund those projects. Of course, it's that fund. Its goal is to have 3 to 5 billion euros for those investment and infrastructure for infrastructure projects in our region, and the needs are 600 billion euros. So it's very hard to cover the needs of the region, and it can only be partial answer for the cooperation in our region, but we have other means, for example, European instruments that are supporting our development, and I believe that we can use those different measures for different needs to reach the goals we set.
So we've got some questions coming in. You can submit a question on the YouTube channel, just in the comment box. And Noah asks for the panelists to speak about Brexit and its effects on the internal dynamics within the EU, and whether it makes, in your view, deeper union more plausible or presages further departures, and what it means for the United States. If anyone would like to take a stab at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously Brexit from the U.S. perspective is a sort of a reality. So I think we just deal in, and in terms of whether it presages more. I mean, frankly, more cohesion and more exits might go together, since it might force a choice on some countries, but. I think Brexit is probably only one of the facets of what's going on in the terms of further European unification. But I don't have a super strong view in terms of the empirical, the likelihood of what's going to happen. But I will say that I think from the U.S. perspective, further European, if it's aligned with us vis-a-vis. Broadly speaking, again, not slavishly or anything, but like broadly aligned with us vis-a-vis the primary challenge, which is China. But if it's not, then it's not really in our interests. And I think that's how we need to look at it.
Well,
Paweł.
From Polish perspective, of course, Brexit was not a good news. In many ways, Great Britain was our partner within the European Union in those debates about sovereignty of the member states in the European Union. So it was not a good event for us, but we tried to build some success on that and to invite companies that were in London City and in other places to settle in Poland. That's the case of JP Morgan, for example. And well, we will try. That's the reality, as it was said, and we have to live as it is.
Another question from the audience. To what degree will President Biden maintain or strengthen the global perception of the United States as a mediator, especially in regard to ambitious nations such as the Russian Federation or Iran or China? Will America, in other words, will America return to some kind of mediating role?
It doesn't seem like they're presenting themselves as mediator as much as kind of more of like a JFK, standard bearer for global democracy, kind of global, the Secretary of State talks about a world contest between techno-authoritarians and techno-democracies. So I don't think they're going to be against mediation, but I don't think that's how they're presenting themselves particularly, or how they envision themselves.
Yes, I fully agree, and I think that the last events in Syria and the missile strikes were part of that strong image that it's not kind of a mediator, but a United States that is acting against hostile countries, not in the character of mediator.
I read there was a press story, I think today, which, bore the distinct fingerprints of having been appropriately messaged by people within the administration, but it said that Biden is trying to place himself between Obama and Trump. I mean, I don't know if that's how they would want to be framed, but that probably is the self-image, at least.
I mean, that implies something about maybe the long-term effects of the Trump administration approach to foreign policy that will, in spite of the current administration's attempt to kind of project a return to the status quo ante, that will somehow remains that description implies that the Trump administration's approach remains like a kind of focal point. What do you think about that, or at least has some permanent effects in our positioning?
I think it does, for sure. I mean, I think obviously things like the shift towards the competition with China, a more confrontational approach to China is going to be enduring. I mean, partially because the Biden administration has endorsed large swaths of it. But I also think things that a lot of people are decrying. There was an article in Foreign Affairs about how people can't unsee the Trump administration in terms of its relationship with allies. And my thinking is, in a lot of respects, that's good. And it's actually good for our alliances because we can't go back to the days in which, I mean, sometimes I worry that some people want to try to, or they're trying to, but I think we can't go back to a point where the Germans are spending 2% of GDP or 1.3 on defense, or the Japanese are spending 1%, or where the United States is engaged in these forever wars in the Middle East with no discernible endpoint, and sort of multi-theater maximalist strategy, high aims. So and that I think President Trump, in his obviously particular way, injected a sort of a refocusing on the interests of Americans, and I think that's going to stay because that is a product of much deeper political and social factors and the geopolitical structure of the world, in which we're no longer we are still a colossus, but there's more than one colossus out there. There are two colossi, I guess. As well as smaller, I think Sam Huntington called it sort of multi-bipolarity or bi-multipolarity. They're basically two major poles, and then there's some significant players that are operating in that context. But I think in that, as you've written about, Gladden, and you've overseen, there's been deindustrialization, slowdown in growth, greater inequality, perceptions of insecurity, and the American people are going to think, and it's only going to get more intense. We piled on pandemic debt, and of course there's the entitlements issue, which is looming, but we have not addressed yet. And that, to me, that's the biggest problem I see with the Biden kind of overall sort of geopolitical approach is the accounts don't balance to me. They're talking like it's 1999, but it's actually not 1999 at all. Right. 1999, right. We were growing at 3% a year. Right? If not more. And there was no country that could plausibly take on the United States in a plausible fight. And we were way ahead in high technology and everything. And none of those things is indisputably true anymore. So
it might be 1999. It might be 1999 again in the stock market. So we'll see. Last comments just before we close, Paweł.
Well, I thought about that. I wanted to refer to that image between, in the middle between Trump and Obama, and many similarities that we can see. I was astonished maybe not astonished, but it surprised me that that rhetoric that Biden's used, that he wants the American foreign policy to serve the interest of the American working families. And I think that's rhetoric of that could serve as well to Donald Trump, and to see the international relations as they can serve the economic interests of particular Americans who have different difficulties as everyone else in current world, very strongly struck by the COVID-19. And that phrase was quite interesting for me, the interests of American working families, that this is the main goal for the American foreign policy. That's the perspective that I didn't expect it.
Any final comment, Bridge, or?
Well, yeah, I think that's referring to our trade policy. It might be our foreign policy, but right. I mean, to me, that's democracy. You know, it's like, well, our foreign policy should be serving the American people and our broader, middle working class, not sort of extremes on parts of the bell curve. But that to me is recentering our foreign policy where it should be, and not making the world safe for democracy everywhere, or solving all the world's problems, or pacifying the Middle East. And I think, candidly, I think Poland is in good shape. Poland spends a lot on defense, pulls its weight. So I think we have a very solid foundation, as I discussed before, with Poland. But I think, if we continue on the course that they're setting out, which is kind of maximalist aims, not supported by a plausible theory for how to resource that, and our traditional allies, many of them continue to pursue the old policy of free riding and sort of flattering the hegemon a little bit, or the old hegemon, I think there's going to be there's like a crisis. I mean, it's sort of a market. At some point, there's going to be a market signal where we can't do it, whether that's a war or a crisis or a strategic realignment or whatever it is. I mean, if Europe doesn't, I mean, I think it's better to be candid. The United States doesn't have the military sized and resource to fight a two-front great power war. And even if Russia goes first, we're going to have to make sure we don't take too much risk in China. So, we can ask so many times to NATO, but at some point, if we have to take a fork in the road, we're going to have to take it for Asia, because it's more important. It's more important for American working families. It just is. And our role there is more important because China is much more dangerous, much more powerful, I should say, than Russia. Russia is obviously very dangerous, as you guys know. But I think that's why we have to be more sort of direct and going forward. But I for one am happy that I commend the Biden administration for talking about trade policy, for instance. On the merits we'll see, but I think moving on from the 1990s and 2000s approach in so many ways is important and valuable, whoever does it.
Very much agreed. Thank you so much to Mr. Colby and Mr. Pawłowski, our guests in this very interesting discussion. And thanks especially to American Affairs and the Warsaw Institute for hosting it. Hope everyone has enjoyed it and look forward to doing it again. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.